My name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. And I am really honored and excited to present our next panel of speakers today, who's going to be really talking to us about the climate crisis that we are entering into and continues to really manage in the next however long we're going to be talking about. But we are just on the heels of the COP26 in Glasgow, and we have this great opportunity to really kind of dig deeper on some of the very real and very, to some, existential threats of the climate change in many communities across the globe. Whatever we may think about the crisis, the reality is that our planets are getting warmer, the sea levels are rising, and we all have to, governments, businesses, and communities have to start thinking about ways to build more resilience against the climate crisis in our communities. So to help us to really unpack all the complexities of this crisis, this issue, we have a great panel of experts today with us. That includes Kate Gordon, who is the Senior Advisor to Secretary of Energy, Granholm. And we have Alice Hill, who is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and also author of The Fight for Climate After COVID-19. And her books are going to be outside for sale after this program, so please pick up a copy on your way out. And then finally, our panel is going to be moderated by Vicki Arroyo, who's the Associate Administrator for Policy at the EPA. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki to start our conversation off today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheyenne. Thank you all for being here. I have to say, I'm a little rusty at this, so please bear with me. This is the first time I'm in a large room, but we're all friends up here. So I feel like this is the right way to sort of re-enter the world post-COVID now that I'm triple vaccinated. And it really is great to be here with Alice Hill, whose book is fabulous. Please get one on the way out, and Kate, to talk about really what I think is the most important issue of our time, which is climate change and the climate crisis that we face. And as you heard, this panel comes at a pivotal time given the COP meeting in Glasgow. And also, as you know, there are active conversations and some legislation that passed on the Hill and more to come, we hope, to deal with the climate crisis. And there's progress being made, but for those of us who've worked on this issue for decades, I would acknowledge that it's probably not quite fast enough given the magnitude of the changes that are already underway. There's increasing concern about the gap between the commitments being offered on the international stage and the actions underway and what is really essential to hold climate change to well below 2 degrees Celsius, or a target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, as the international dialogue has espoused. And while there was some encouraging progress at COP26, including a joint agreement between the world's 2 largest emitters, China and the US, to accelerate efforts on emissions from methane pollution, we still have quite a ways to go. We have achieved some other essential agreements in Glasgow, though, and I just want to tick some of these off before we open up to more of a conversation. Agreement among 100 countries representing 85% of the world's forest to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. In partnership with the EU, we've grown the methane pledge to more than 100 countries, representing about half of the world's methane emissions and 70% of the global GDP. We announced our own methane emissions reduction action plan in the US to redouble efforts from across government to dramatically reduce methane emissions, cut consumer costs, protect workers and communities, maintain and create high-quality union-friendly jobs, and promote US innovation and manufacturing. We've made commitments to climate-smart agriculture to spur innovation and catalyze private finance for a clean economy, and to drive investment in clean and climate-resilient infrastructure. And we announced the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or PREPARE, and committed to work with Congress to provide $3 billion in adaptation finance annually. The largest US commitment ever made to reduce climate impacts on those most vulnerable to climate change worldwide. But as I started with, the window for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is narrowing, And for our part, the US plans to keep raising our ambition and delivering on the goals that we set, reducing US emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And over the past several months, the Biden administration, which I'm proud to be a part of, has made substantial progress towards keeping that goal within reach. And of course, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which President Biden signed on Monday, includes significant investments in climate mitigation and adaptation and equity, many billions of dollars for zero and low emitting school and transit buses, for networks of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for investment in transit and electric grid reliability, climate resilience, $50 billion and more. And my agency, EPA, is doing its part, regulating emissions of greenhouse gases and other air pollution from cars and trucks, phasing down production and use of climate-damaging hydrofluorocarbons, tackling emissions of the potent greenhouse gas methane from the oil and gas sector, and much more. We are making progress in transitioning to cleaner energy and alternative vehicles through recent steps by the administration and the private sector, rulemakings, investments, outreach, but the pace of these changes and commitments has not kept up with the impacts that we're observing. And so these subjects, both climate mitigation and adaptation, are what we'll be talking about with you over the next hour. And again, I'm really delighted to be here with Alice and with Kate, who are experts really on both of these subjects. So we're going to have a conversation that will probably be a bit free-flowing. And I want to start with Alice, because Alice just returned from the COP in Glasgow and would love to hear what you think are the highlights of the agreements that were reached and any concerns that you might have coming out of that dialogue.
Well, I have to say it was a very unusual experience post-COVID. I've been at home in my yoga pants in front of my computer, and then suddenly I'm at a meeting with 25,000 people, all in some big kind of convention center spaces. And truthfully, for me, it resembled a trade show more than anything else. It's full of pavilions that the US had one, South Africa, Korea, Japan, and then you have different organizations putting together pavilions. And as you walk by, it's almost like they're hawkers who want to say, here, this is what we're doing. Here's a brochure, and then there might be a panel going on. So lots of milling about, lots of exchanging of business cards. And then to the side are negotiation rooms where the negotiators, and this is an extraordinary conference, probably the most consequential, and for this group in particular, worldwide conference we've had. We have 197 nations represented at that conference. And so those negotiators from those 197 countries, and then there's some observer organizations, go off in these negotiating rooms. It's restricted access there. I was able to go in, but it sounds very sexy, but it's actually, if you can imagine, a bunch of people poring over wording and saying, no, I think that shouldn't be the right word or whatever. So the action really was out more in the trade show. But of course, at the end, there were two, I thought, particularly extraordinary moments. The first is that 197 countries signed on to what is now known as the Glasgow Climate Pact. So that means 197 countries agreed to every word in that pact. And that pact still sets the aim to keep heating, and the heating is caused by human activity forming this big blanket of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions that just trap the heat. Kind of like when your mom used to throw a blanket on you in the middle of the night and you got that blanket over you, you wake up and you're really hot. Well, that's what's happening here. And all these nations agreed that we have to keep that heating to desirably 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid really catastrophic impacts. And I think that's very significant. Of course, the devil's in the details. Countries and others made, as you've heard from Vicki, made lots of pledges. Will they come through? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. But we do know that they all agreed on that. And the second thing that I thought was particularly significant is they said, we're coming back next year. We're all going to come back and show what we've done even in this 1 year. And why is it such a compact schedule? Because the scientists have told us if we want to keep it to 1.5 degrees, we have till 2030 to cut emissions by 50%. Now that sounds very daunting, but if we say we're going to come back in 5 years to check on how things are going, unlikely there would be much progress. So next year will be consequential. And then the final thing, I think, was an incredible victory by the United States and China to come to an agreement to overcome the Cold War that has essentially descended over our relations between with China, to say we are going to work together on this one problem. Because we recognize if we don't, essentially, we're all going over the cliff together. So we as the two biggest emitters need to step up here. So those were my big takeaways here. Lots of other things, as Vicki said, lots of excitement. But Alec Sharma, who was the president of the Conference of Parties for the United Kingdom that was hosting this big event, basically said 1.5 degrees is still alive, but there's barely a pulse. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we are. We're going to see if we can make progress, but the good news is nations still have that very much in mind.
Thank you very much for that. It was like being there again, which I wasn't able to do this year. So Kate, you've worked on the global energy transition for many years, and you've done that at the international and federal level, but you've also done that leading work in California, which of course is a leader among US states. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on this challenge, and also why your work right now on a just economic and energy transition is so important to being able to succeed?
Thanks, Vicki. And I also wasn't able to go to COP this year, although I heard the Australian pavilion had really good coffee. So apparently everybody was lined up at the Australian pavilion. People kept sending me. And there was also vegetarian haggis in the cafe.
Yes, that's true too.
I don't know what that is, but
yeah, I didn't taste that.
That was interesting. So I got, we all lived vicariously through all our friends, right? Vegetarian haggis, neeps and tatties, I should say, is what it was all together. So for those of you who are Scots fans out there. So one of the things about COP, and it goes to your question, is there was a real emphasis this year, and I think there's a growing kind of emphasis in general, certainly here in the US, and certainly the Department of Energy, on what this transition is going to look like. And it's interesting, I have been in my office a bit this week. We're still kind of slowly coming back. And every time you go into the 7th floor where the secretary is in Department of Energy, you pass the original document that created the department. And it says in 1977, and it says on it, created to deal with the energy problems of today, the transition, and the research and development to solve those challenges. And that's really what we do still. And so for us, and for the US, this administration as well, this question of how we get from here to there is a really important question. COP is often reported out as being all about the goal, right? It's about we need to stay at 1.5. We need to do X by Y date. How you actually do that, how you actually get from our current system to that system that we need to get to, which is dramatically decarbonized from our current system across every sector of the economy, is a massive challenge, and particularly a political challenge and an economic challenge for many places that are extremely fossil fuel dependent. We think often, of course, of those countries that are building out their fossil infrastructure now, so still building coal plants, India, China, good examples that have this massive population growth, and so they're trying to figure out how to meet those energy demands, and defaulting in some cases to what they've done in the past. And part of the challenge is about that, and about figuring out ways. We announced actually at COP, the Department of Energy helped to lead this Better World Challenge, which is all about bringing our technology expertise from our 17 national labs to those countries that are having exactly this challenge. How do you, instead of saying in India, for instance, don't build that coal plant, how do you say, here is a package of financing and technology that can replace what you're trying to do with that coal plant, and here is how we're going to support you in doing that. So we're doing a lot of that from an international transition perspective. But as you said, Vicki, we also have places in the United States that are extraordinarily dependent on fossil technologies. Wyoming, 58% of Wyoming's tax base comes from the fossil industry, for instance. It's the highest percent of any state, but you have a similar percentages up in that level, above 30% for New Mexico, for Alaska, and then down a little bit lower for West Virginia, and then the last one I think is North Dakota. But we have very fossil-dependent states. We have my state of California, where I was just serving in the governor's office for the last 3 years, running just transition work. We have counties like Kern County, for people who've been there, where Bakersfield is, which are extraordinarily fossil-dependent. So we're also thinking at the Department of Energy and across the administration a lot about what that transition looks like. And the president, one of his first things he did in one of his first executive orders on climate was to create the interagency work group on coal and power plant communities, which is really, Vicki is a part of, EPA is a part of, which is really focused with 11 agencies focused on this question of how do we think about this transition, not just as a goal-setting exercise, not just as an emissions counting exercise, but actually it's an economic diversification challenge. It's a job creation challenge. We're really digging in with all these agencies. Commerce and the Economic Development Administration are part of this. USDA is part of this. Treasury, EPA, as I said. I mean, it's a transportation, labor. We're digging in and we're saying, what is it actually going to take to do the planning for what that future looks like, to look at the asset mapping for these places? What kinds of infrastructure exists today? How can we build on that infrastructure? And how can we look toward the future? And one of the things we're doing is actually literally directing targeted funding to this problem. The Economic Development Administration just put out an unprecedented $3 billion in economic development funding through the American Rescue Plan. We dedicated $300 million of that to coal communities, specifically to start addressing these issues. We are doing work at the Department of Energy, and I'll say this last, and then I know we want to move on, but we're devoting a lot of energy to this question of fossil asset repurposing. When you have a coal plant that's closing or closing, what you have is a gold mine from an industry perspective. It's got access to transmission, transportation, water rights, and a workforce that's already skilled in a lot of trade skills and manufacturing skills. How can we think about building on that for the industries of the future? And in fact, 2 days ago, in our first ever Department of Energy infrastructure bill announcement, we just sent $1.5 billion to Wyoming to convert a closed coal plant to a small modular reactor out there in Wyoming, in a town where the coal plant closed 2 years ago, and they've essentially had no economic activity since then. So it's actually kind of an exciting moment, but it takes a lot. It takes a lot of engagement with places. It takes a very kind of bespoke approach to every place, and it takes a lot of interagency collaboration, which is, anyone who's worked in the federal government knows, not easy. But really exciting.
Well, that's a good segue to the next topic that I wanted to talk about, which is how do we get out of our silos, whether they be sectoral silos, because these problems tend to cascade, as we see with disasters like Ida, which hit my home state of Louisiana recently, and a storm that may or may not cause flooding also caused a power outage that actually in Louisiana killed more people from the heat when they had no power for days and days. And they're still trying to get back on their feet from that, as they are also, trying to tackle their own role in the climate crisis. I will say, for the first time, the governor of Louisiana was one of the governors who went to the COP this year, John Bell Edwards, and we had the opportunity to meet with him when I was down in Louisiana this week with the administrator. And it just shows, I think, what you're saying, that all the states, whether they're oil and gas states historically or coal states, are really thinking about what is our state's role in this transition. How can we play to our strengths? How can we build on the training that our people have, the resources that we have, the river and things like that? But to the point about silos, this is a real heavy lift. And when you look at something like the infrastructure bill, there's a lot of money there, but how do we actually avoid having these silos do things that might actually, even contradict each other? And Alice, I was interested in something that your book, The Fight for Climate After COVID, mentions about how to address these silos, including even thinking about climate mitigation goals and adaptation. It's often even different people in the agencies, in the NGOs who work on this. So how do we actually try to get past that?
Great question. And of course, with climate change, there are two sides. I think a third side is developing, but there's the side of cutting emissions. We call that mitigation. So that's cutting the harmful greenhouse gas emissions that come from deforestation, driving cars, construction, forming that blanket around the globe. So that's one side, and that contains the heating. And then the side that Vicki and I have spent a good deal of our career on is adaptation. That's preparing for the unavoidable impacts that we're already experiencing. So, for example, the extreme heat that we had in the Pacific Northwest this summer, scientists can now tell us it was 150 times more likely to hit those heat extremes because we have climate change, because we have that accumulation of emissions. The types of extreme rain bombs that are hitting pretty much anywhere, just hitting Canada, all that rain falling at once, a warmer atmosphere holds more water, dumps all at once, and no infrastructure is ready for this. There's no way we have the piping and the drainage ready for this. And then I'll just mention, I think the third area where we're going to see greater interest is if we fail in cutting our emissions and containing heating, we'll see what's called geoengineering. So we'll have major interventions in the environment. There are already, for example, China is reportedly seeding clouds to change the monsoon season to make sure it gets enough rain. Of course, that affects your neighbors, and so this is a geopolitical concern as well. One thing that I think in looking across this space is that we need to have serious planning. It was Dwight Eisenhower, who of course was leading the Allied troops, who said, plans are useless, but planning is essential. And I take away from that that the plans help us work through, understand what each other's roles are, understand who's going to take responsibility for what. Of course, the plan will never unfold as we anticipate, but without planning, we're just at risk. And this is we have a watchdog for our government, the Government Accountability Office, and they've said what we're doing in adaptation right now is just sprinkling money. We're not really planning for where do we need to make big investments? What's going to happen in the future? Where should we be looking as communities are changing in response to these events? So I think that a national plan is a very important tool, and there's some nations that we do not have a national plan on adaptation. Some nations who have made great progress, the Netherlands, Thailand, Singapore, Korea, have really invested in this concept of we're going to figure out what is the role of our national government, what is the role of our subnational governments, so the state, local, tribal for us, and then what is the role of civil society? What should we expect them to be doing as we are seeing very, very rapid changes? You know, we are seeing a rate of change that scientists say we haven't seen in 65 million years. So human civilization just developed over an 8,000 year period, or 10,000, and that our climate was really stable. We are moving off of stability, and we already have very quickly. All of our decisions up to now have assumed the climate is stable. They've assumed that you can look at the past and know what to do in the future. That assumption is a poor one now. And so how do we drive everyone to recognize that circumstances have changed and are changing even more quickly as we speak? And then what role do each of us have to play in that? And that forces the federal agencies to define for each other, you know, I have this as EPA, or I have that as energy, or DHS, or whatever role it is. And then it helps the state and local governments understand who's doing what in the federal government. And then the state and local governments can interact with the civil society. And it has to be a top down, but bottom up. Mm-hmm. It's iterative as everyone understands how to deal with this challenge that no human has ever confronted before. This is novel, We honestly don't really understand fully how we'll deal with it, but we know it's changing very quickly. And if we don't make better choices, we're going to build the bridge that fails, because we're not going to account for that extra flow of water from a rain bomb or from sea level rise. And thousands of other examples, but if we don't start accounting for that now, we're going to spend a lot of money on things that don't work. And that's why this bill is so important, because it's called out the need for climate resilient infrastructure. And that is critical. We shouldn't be spending money on things that haven't accounted for the change conditions that the structure will meet over its service life, be it 50 years, 100 years, whatever. It needs to be able to be adjusted to match the changing conditions it will encounter.
So, you bring up the states and the local governments that are on the front lines for these impacts. And Kate, we've both worked for and with governors who often, point to those disasters, the fact that, they're having to declare these emergencies one after another, 500-year, 1,000-year storms that are now happening in back-to-back years in some places, or a year-round fire season in California. How do we pivot from that messaging to action, though, right? I mean, they're really good. Political leaders are often really good about, seizing that moment and pointing to those impacts. But how do you really get to a conversation not just about, we want to green our economy as a result of these impacts, but we also want to prepare and we want to invest differently?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because in part it's politically hard to take on something like adaptation, because it's a long-term proposition. It's about doing the design and build process differently, and doing the budgeting differently, and amortizing things differently. I mean, it just is a different way to go about doing budgeting, and most people don't want to change that. And also, as you just said, people take disasters as a moment because they get a lot of press, right? So it's a good moment to sort of say, here we're going to do all these grand plans. But I do think the sheer number of disasters, and you probably know, actually, off the top of your head, one of you, how many we had last year that were over $1 billion?
We had 22 separate disasters that were over $1 billion. That doesn't include all the smaller ones. Yeah. And I can't recall the number, but the chart is going up through the roof in terms of costs.
Exactly, and it's having real impact on states and local governments. When I was in California, the agency that I ran was involved in the wildfire response in a big way. And in 2020, we spent in California $1 billion on wildfire response. And that wasn't even forest management. That was people and equipment. That was 3 times what we budgeted for.
Wow.
And that's significant, because what that means is we had to reallocate all kinds of funds to do that. And we then weren't spending on other things. And we started, what ends up happening, and this kind of goes to why adaptation and mitigation have to be thought of together also, we ended up reallocating funds that we would have otherwise spent on things like forest management, or on EV chargers, or on other parts of our climate agenda, because there's a pot of money for kind of climate-related things. And if more and more and more of that pot is going to disaster response, and it's not just the firefighters, right? I mean, disaster response is incredibly expensive from a state perspective or a government budget perspective, because it comes with all kinds of safety net issues also. You have to pay for disaster response, fire response, but you also have to pay for support for people to get food who've been displaced, and for eviction, assistance, and for relocation, and for health impacts, and for all of these things. It's this huge multiplier effect. And so what we are seeing, and we used to talk about this with other governors and with mayors all the time, budgets, and it's happening with the federal government. I mean, FEMA stopped giving us as much as they used to because their budget is so stretched. Governments are spending so much on this that it's becoming sort of like, this much of our budget is disaster plus all of the outcomes of disaster, and then is this shrinking to spend for future, for competitiveness, for fighting climate change, for reducing emissions, for building out industries. So this is something we have to get ahead of. And I really agree. I mean, I spent a bunch of time on this in my career, but I really, really agree that we actually need to take, in this case, a page from the private sector and make this part of our budget process and treat climate risk like a material risk, and actually do the accounting and get in there and say, look, if we are putting a multi-decadal piece of infrastructure in the ground, we need to account for what science says is going to happen in a very granular sense in that place. And we actually have the data. I mean, it's amazing what we have in terms of granular climate data on physical climate impacts. It's incredible. Department of Energy has a massive amount of infrastructure, and we're actually doing that accounting now because the White House has asked us to. And it's just incredibly important. You start to see sort of, you know, where all of the stress points going to be. The last thing I'll say about it is one other place where they're related. Extreme heat, which is the impact that's actually the most predictable of all the climate impacts, is has a huge impact on our power grid, right? Because as it gets hotter, our central power plants need more cooling, they get less efficient, so they produce less. Our transmission lines actually have higher line loss, they lose more electrons as it gets hotter, and people are ramping up their electricity because of air conditioning. So all of that causes actually a much less efficient system that has to be then backed up with a bunch of other things. That's a mitigation issue just as much as it is an adaptation issue, and I think an important one to think about.
So in a minute, I'll open it up to questions, but I just want to say I'm especially delighted to be here and have the honor of moderating this panel with two women leaders on this issue, because that's not always the case. And I'm also honored to serve on a White House Gender Policy Council, which has acknowledged in a recent report that women globally are disproportionately affected by climate impacts. Certainly internationally that's the case, but we also saw disproportionate impacts on female-headed households after Katrina, for example. You know, how they didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to bring often elders and their kids back to the city and go back to the lives that they had left behind. They're also not as represented in boardrooms or positions of power. You know, we'd just like your insights on that from your career and perspective.
Well, honestly, I mean, obviously, I've been a woman, and I've had a long girl and a woman, and I've had a long professional career. I was a prosecutor, and then a judge, and then I began working on other things, and then I've been in climate change. And I've thought a lot about women in the workforce, a lot about the challenges that we face. Honestly, it wasn't until I started writing this book where I really began to understand how climate change will be catastrophic for women and girls. And this is particularly in the developing world. You know, when climate change brings a lot of disasters, a lot of big storms. And women are something like 14 times more likely to die in a disaster. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's physical strength. They're taking care of others. They don't get athletic training, so they can't climb the tree. They sometimes culturally have to wear heavier clothing, which is going to weight them down in a storm. They may not have learned to swim. Lots of reasons. So we know we're going to have a lot of big events, and we're going to see a lot of women die as a result of that. And then we know that girls and women are, in some cultures, the last to eat. And so we're going to have food shortages. I think Madagascar has the first famine from climate change. That's what's being reported, and it's going to be girls and women. They're often the last to eat at the table. That means that it's bad for the future generations. That means that babies are stunted. Because the mother's malnourished, and then when the baby's born, a great risk of malnourishment and stunting, which I learned about when I was in the White House. I've been a judge. I hadn't really focused on these things, but it's we had improved. We're now going backwards, but it means that cognitive ability, physical ability, it is just lasting for the person who's stunted, but also for the economy of that country if they have a generation of stunted kids. And then we know that girls are pulled out of school faster. When the bad thing happens and the family doesn't have sufficient resources, it's the girl who doesn't go to school. And women and girls have to now go, they're often in the family, they fetch the water, and they have to walk further now because of drought and water insecurity. If you just look at what happened during COVID, that's kind of a glimpse of what it will be. More women lost their jobs. We had soaring rates of child marriage, and the child is the girl. It's not the boy, it's the girl that's the family hands over because essentially you get money for the child. And of course, that means that girl is out of school and never going back to school. So I had never thought through how systematically it undermines the experience of women and girls, and that they will pay a higher penalty than men. So at the COP, there was a day devoted to gender. The COP now got lots of criticism because most of the world leaders, I think 90% were male, 10% women, and most of them were older. And so what we saw was older men making the decisions in the COP facility. Outside, there were 100,000 protesters. Many of those were young women who just recognized that they are at greater risk of what's happening. I think it's an underappreciated issue, and I certainly was guilty of that, even though I'd had plenty of opportunity to think through these things. I just had never thought, what does it really mean to be in a hotter world for women and girls?
Thank you for unpacking that. Kate, anything to add?
I mean, just really briefly, because that was, I mean, I just learned things from that, so thank you, Alice. Just really briefly, I mean, one, for those who've read the Paul Hawken book, Drawdown, which is his sort of list of the actions individuals or countries can take to reduce our climate impact, in the top 5 is education of women and girls, which is not something we think about all the time when we think about sort of immediate actions, but for all the reasons you just said. Also because when women are less educated in poorer countries, often have more children, which has a climate impact, of course. But the other thing, and I think it's sort of from my US perspective, one of the things that I've really thought about a lot with both actually kind of what we call kind of physical climate risk and transition risk, because that really means the impacts themselves, but also the transition to a new kind of economy, to a net zero economy. Transitions like that and displacement like that are very, very hard on those without mobility, and women just tend to be less mobile than men, even in the US, because of lower wages, because of less home ownership, and just because of less assets in general that are liquid. So,
and caretaking too.
And caretaking
probably.
too, and more tied to networks of caretaking. A lot of times people will say, why can't people just move from X town where the coal plant has closed or the mine has closed? Often it's because there's generations who are doing caretaking and childcare in that place, and it's not that easy to pick up and leave that, and take on that cost, and take on the cost of new housing, and take on all the costs that come to moving to a new place. So I think there are a lot of impacts that we don't always think about, and that have been definitely something that I've sort of seen a lot in the work that I've done.
So with that, why don't we open the floor to questions, and someone will hand the mic.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion and what you have shared with us. My name is Nikolina Angelko. I'm from Bulgaria, Bulgarian Member of Parliament, and I was Minister of Transport and Tourism for a couple of years. My question is how US will encourage China and India, for example, as you said, that are one of the main polluters in the world, but not to forget Brazil. I remember in 2019, the rainforest fires in Amazon, and currently more carbon is emitted than can be absorbed. So this also in the future, and even now is creating problems, but in the future will be more. I agree that the new technologies and the fourth industrial revolution will help, but the political will to implement that is crucial. So I'm very happy that US came back in the climate change Paris Agreement, because as a leading world force, it's really important in this topic to have leaders that understand the problem. So I would like to understand your thoughts, how we are going all together encourage or even push, this is a strong word, but it should be used in that case, the countries like China, India, Brazil, and much more to keep the rules. Thank you.
Do you want to take that?
I can take a piece of it, maybe. I mean, it's a really good question. And, these agreements are voluntary, as you know, the Paris Agreement and the new pact. Although there is a fair amount of peer pressure that happens at the COP. I mean, I think that you can't underestimate how, and how important it is for countries to feel that they're keeping up with other countries. But I mean, I would say a couple things. One is always incentives, right? I mean, a lot of the conversation at the COP was about global finance and about how much money more developed countries can put on the table to support those countries that are, in fact, going through their own industrial revolutions, essentially, and growing very, very fast. Not just how much money can we put in from sort of a sheer development perspective, but also into particular things around industrial decarbonization, for instance, really bringing down the emissions of concrete and steel, which are such a huge part of global development. And part of all of our clean energy technologies too. If you look at a wind turbine is 80% steel. So, these things matter to the clean energy economy. So bringing down those percentages, figuring out ways to both incentivize that through technology transfer, through kind of, direct support to technology partnerships, which we do a lot of with China actually, and also to sort of a little bit of the stick of, trade agreements that prioritize, lower emission technologies. So we're doing some of that. There are technologies that are going to be critically needed, and I should have said this earlier, but one of the ones that's really was at the forefront of the COP, and we at Department of Energy are spending a lot of time on, is carbon removal. So just to separate that out from, sometimes people think of carbon capture and storage, and they think of what we've been using that technology for mostly in the past, which is like enhanced oil recovery, for instance, injecting carbon underground and bringing up oil. There's really interesting new technology now to actually directly capture carbon from the air and remove it, and then do long-term geologic storage and or inject it into products like cement, for instance, and create kind of new and stronger products. We did a big earth shot at the COP from the US on just committing a huge amount more resources to that, and actually doing that in partnership with other countries, because this is one of those things where, we have to bring down emissions tomorrow, but we also have to deal with the emissions in the air today. As Alice was just saying, this is one of those technologies that sort of helps support both. So I think, again, carrots, technology transfer, again, market creation. I mean, all of this stuff around electric vehicles, that's a market creation approach, and certainly Vicki's agency does a ton of work on that. It's, we buy a lot of cars in the United States, an enormous amount of cars. My former state, California, has 26 million of them, so we have a lot of them. And having that many creates just a massive market. And so how can we do these sort of market creation agreements across countries that don't rise to the level of climate diplomacy, but where we say we're all going to collectively say we're going to only sell EVs by this date? That creates a massive global market. So those are some of the tools. But we don't have a world government, right? I mean, we have a system of collaboration and cooperation and these voluntary agreements. And so I think that's something we're all struggling with, is how do we maximize that as a tool? And each of you have something more to say.
I mean, I would just say, and it's especially hard to your point, when the US, which is historically the biggest emitter, is in and out of these agreements, Right. And there's this sort of rhetoric here in the US often that, the problem is China and they're not doing anything, when in fact they're doing a lot on electric vehicles. They've tried out carbon markets before we've done it, really, at the federal level, I mean, as somebody who worked on previous cap and trade bills, back in the day when there was a lot of industry support, bipartisan support for that, I don't think most of us who worked on those issues back in the late 90s would think that we'd be here in 2021 and still not have a price on carbon in our own country. So, it's definitely made it hard to expect leadership from other countries, but I think some of those examples are really excellent. Alice, anything to add?
Oh, I can't add anything to that. That was well done.
Another question?
I do have a question. Thank you. Angela Weck from Peoria. So one of the side conversations at COP26 was the Global Methane Project, and a discussion of a significant reduction of methane without any additional financial expense. Can you talk about that at all?
I can do it.
Yeah, go on.
That was an exciting development, and that really, I think, surprised many countries because it was led by the EU and the United States. And here in the United States, I do sit on the board of the Environmental Defense Fund, who had called out methane and as one of the areas that we all need to focus on. And why do we need to focus on methane? Methane is a greenhouse gas, and it doesn't last as long as carbon. Carbon is up there in the atmosphere for, could be hundreds of years. So carbon causes long-term heating. Methane is much more short-lived, maybe 2 decades. But during the time it's up there in the atmosphere, it contributes up to 80 times more heating than carbon does. So it's really heats us up quickly, and if you look at how we've heated so far, we're at about 1.1 degrees Celsius above what we were pre-industrial times. So as a result of all of our activities, we have heated up 1.1%. About 0.5 of that is from methane. So we've experienced a lot more heating, and we've had a lot more emissions of methane recently, so we're heating up more quickly. And the scientists identified, well, wait a minute, if we pull back on our methane, we won't heat up as quickly, so that means fewer big brain dumps, less extreme heat. We won't have the impacts, and that will buy us more time to figure out what we need to do with all the carbon that has a longer term effect. So we had over 105 nations, and that really covers a lot of the, I think it's 90% of the methane emitted, agree that by 2030, they're going to reduce methane by 30%. And that will slow the warming if we can honor that. So it's a very significant development in terms of keeping us safe and buying some more time. It doesn't mean we can pack up our tents and say it's all over, but it was, I thought, a very smart move to try to give us a little bit more room to figure out how we're going to get all these nations to work together to come to a conclusion on the carbon emissions.
And part of those announcements included an EPA proposal that would reduce emissions not just of the greenhouse gases, but some of the toxic substances that are also released in those operations, like benzene and conventional pollution as well. And we intend to issue a supplemental proposal in 2022. So stay tuned for more, but there's definitely a lot of action on methane for the reasons that Alice said. One more question maybe before I want to wrap up with a question of my own. Oh.
I'm from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I'm a public school teacher of 27 years, and I've been teaching English language learners as well as on-level American students. And one of the concerns that we have as a Junior World Affairs Council and my school is that what can they do? What are the do's and don'ts of 15 to 19-year-olds for climate change? Because we've had one conference discussion already with the chief climatologist of NASA from the Goddard Center in New York, and we're going to have a follow-up in December from someone who's going to talk to us about how Texas is not only an emitter of pollutants, but also a recipient of the climate change. What do's and don'ts for 15 to 19-year-olds that we can all take back to our Junior World Affairs Council?
Well, one of the things that EPA did actually at the COP was to have a conversation with youth leaders from around the country and the world. And one of the things that they urged us to do is to set up a council, which some states and countries have, a council of some of the young people who are leaders, as Alice said, you know, they're household names, some of them now, like Greta Thunberg, and, you know, people like that in our own country who sometimes sit on mayors or state councils where they can be active in solutions, both, you know, what you can do at home, but then also like, you know, voting and policy solutions as well. And I think that giving young people a sense of purpose like that is really important. You know, we're already seeing climate grief, you know, the fact that young people are questioning whether or not they should have children because the world, you know, in 2100 and 2050 for that matter might look very different, you know, and I think it's really important to have them feel like they're part of solutions, whether it be climate mitigation and steps that you could take at home, but also adaptation as well. But would love to hear what others here say.
Oh, excellent question. And my advice to every young person is this is the Full Employment Act. you will be able to find a job in climate change. And if you take the time to start educating yourself now, and as you think about your college education, the more you learn about climate change, you will have no shortage of jobs available. I can tell you, I work with corporate heads, I work with governments, everyone is scrambling to find people who understand climate change. There's a broader recognition. These impacts are here. You just look out your window and you know these impacts are here. They're getting worse, and everyone wants to know what to do. So my advice to young people is make sure you are picking a course of study that's going to have you ready to understand the basic physics of climate change and then how it's going to unfold. And I would say secondarily, lucky you, because what you do see is, and there's a huge divide in the audiences I speak to, the younger audience and the older audience. The older audience is typically more skeptical. The younger audience is like, why are you leaving us with this mess? Your generation, I spoke to one yesterday, you're very polite, but essentially your generation has really made a mess of this, and we're gonna have to be cleaning it up. So then I tell those young people, if you want a sense of meaning and purpose, get involved. Because sitting on the sidelines on this, you're going to feel helpless. When you see your community damaged, you read about girls being trafficked, you read all the horrible things that are being predicted and unfolding, you will feel so much better to have that sense of engagement. So that's my advice to them is don't stand on the sidelines, educate yourself, and there will be a job for you in law. One of the favorite things is if you want to be involved in climate change, become a lawyer. I'm a former judge. Courts are full of law cases about climate. Yeah. Architecture, engineering, public health, policy, you name it, every single sector and system, step back from this, is affected by climate change. Everything. You cannot name a system or sector that's not affected. So if you have some knowledge of climate change, you can add great value to that, whatever pursuit you choose. So I can't encourage them enough, and they'll probably have very exciting careers as a result of it, and be fully employed.
Oh, I mean, that was great. I mean, it's just really underscore, this is about everything. I sometimes say to people that ignoring climate change as if it doesn't matter in your world is like ignoring globalization. You can act as if globalization does not exist. However, it'll be very, very hard for you to get a job, to be in the world, to act as if, under reality. And so this is a system that is a macroeconomic system that affects absolutely everything we do, and I could not agree more. It is not something that you can just think is somebody else's issue. Love the idea of people getting more involved also in local decisions. I always used to tell people when I was in California with that question, go to your city council meetings. Almost every issue that comes up, particularly issues around planning and land use, are climate issues at one level or another. Most of our emissions in this country are from transportation. How much we drive is a climate issue. How many options we have not to do that is a climate issue. So get involved.
Right, active transportation, alternative transportation, all of those things. So
affordable housing.
Right.
I mean, just being able to live somewhere where you don't have to drive. These are all climate issues.
Right. So I want to try to end on an upbeat note, which is very difficult when you talk about climate change. But I think, Alice, you started us on this path by talking about young people. I mean, what gives you hope, and what words of hope can you leave us with?
Well, I think we are all optimists, so that, of course, gives me hope. Now, the fact that we're all optimists is probably hurting us in terms of our progress. And I love the analogy from Freakonomics. We all think we're not going to be affected by climate change. It's becoming harder to believe that, but that's the optimism that we use. And the Freakonomics authors said, that's why you have so many people marching down the aisle saying, till death do us part, and then we have a high divorce rate. That's optimism to get us through life, and that's very important, and I have a lot of optimism. I also have optimism when I see the growing interest in this field and the growing sense that we need to do things. And then personally, for me, I have had a really varied career. I've been very honored to work on a lot of interesting topics, but there's nothing that requires as much innovation, creativity, imaginative systems thinking than climate change. Now, as I said, I was a judge, and as a judge, you're constantly, you ask the lawyers, could we do it this way? Oh, no, precedent said, the case says you can't do it. Could we do it this way? No, well, we tried that, it doesn't work. In climate change, you never hear that. We haven't tried it. So every idea is good, and there's an energy there of how can we have better outcomes. So for me, that gives me optimism and hope and gets me excited every day about what can we accomplish in having a better future, even in the face of climate change.
Kate.
I think you're right. We all are optimists because it's hard to work in this field if you're not an optimist. But lots of things give me hope, and one of them is this is my very wonky answer to this question, but I actually have hope, partly because this is very wonky. I'm warning you, the global financial system is changing. That gives me hope. We are really seeing now climate impacts and climate thinking ahead about these transitions, these technology changes, these future growth industries really start to be incorporated into mainstream thinking in finance and economics and in business schools, and we're teaching it and we're living it, and it's very exciting. That sounds not very exciting, but the fact that there was a big meeting of finance ministers at COP, which had not happened really in the past. In the past, it's really been the sustainability people, right? It's like, if you think about a corporation, it's been the sustainability officer, it's not been the CFO. The CFOs were at COP, and that is a big change, and that actually does give me hope, because those underlying systems are super important when it comes to how we're actually gonna make this work, so.
That's great. And it gives me hope to have wonderful colleagues like you working so hard on this issue with us. And I agree.
Alice's book gives me hope.
An observation, yes. Go. We have to learn about the book signing next. But I also think the point that you made earlier, Kate, about so many of these things actually provide for win-wins. Like, if you work on these issues, especially at the local or state level, you see that a lot of the things that we would do for climate are things that are good for air pollution, they're good for habitat, they're good for quality of life, for community building. Whether it's more green space, right, for the rains to fall on or to help keep the temperatures lower, more affordable housing close in to people's work that saves you time as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So I hope you all will join us in this fight, and I hope you'll read Alice's book to learn more. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.